Now, moving on to the Battle of Pearl Harbor, which is, of course, the battle that brought America into the war. You know, this is something that we tend to take for granted, that there would be this air attack on the U.S. base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. You know, today, we've all seen movies or pictures of the Battle of Pearl Harbor, and we tend to take it for granted that airplanes are going to attack ships and sink ships. But this was not something that much of the world was prepared for in 1941. Aircraft carriers were still a very new military technology. Rear Admiral William Moffett helped to build up the Naval Aviation Bureau. Billy Mitchell, the swashbuckling aviator, showed in 1921 that bombs dropped from an airplane could sink battleships. The U.S. built its first aircraft carrier, the USS Langley, in 1922. And by 1941, the U.S. had 7 aircraft carriers. But they had already by that point lost the lead in naval warfare, at least temporarily, to Japan, which was the most successful innovator in naval aviation in the interwar period, just as the Germans had been the most successful innovators in armored warfare in the interwar period. The Japanese naval air arm had been largely created with British help in the early 1920s, but then the Japanese took it from there. By 1941, the Japanese had developed the finest naval aircraft, the finest aircraft carriers, the finest aerial torpedoes in the world. It came as a complete surprise when Japanese aircraft appeared over Hawaii on early Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
The day that will live in infamy, as Franklin D. Roosevelt called it. 350 Japanese aircraft sank or crippled 18 U.S. ships. Every U.S. battleship was sunk, although many of them were later recovered. The only thing that went wrong was that 2 U.S. aircraft carriers, the Lexington and the Enterprise, were not at Pearl Harbor, so they were not attacked, they were not sunk by this Japanese surprise attack, but otherwise it was a completely one-sided victory for Japan, and not just the victory for Japan, but for the whole idea of naval aviation, showing the dominance of aircraft carriers in warfare. But the Japanese dominance was not to last long. In June 1942, the U.S. Navy got its revenge at the Battle of Midway using the aircraft carriers which had not been hit at Pearl Harbor. Losing those battleships, in fact, in some ways, was a blessing in disguise for the U.S. Navy, because it forced the U.S. naval leadership to discard the battleship as the principal capital ship of their fleet and to focus on aircraft carriers instead. By the end of the war, the U.S. had built 100 aircraft carriers. They had 18,000 aircraft deployed in the Pacific. Japan simply could not keep up. Now, the U.S. focus during the interwar period had not been on aircraft carriers. It had certainly not been on armored warfare. The U.S., because of its geography, saw itself as essentially almost a continental-sized island. It was remote from the threats of Europe and Asia, and so it focused A, on naval warfare, but B, on long-range aviation, because especially the vast distances in the Pacific, the U.S. focused on power projection, building long-range bombers, and did a better job than any other country in the world. The B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were both used in Europe to attack Germany during World War II.